Okay, we're going to start with our next lecture, which will be given by Berenike Herman. She's from the University of Göttingen, and she's also one of our esteemed board members of IGEL. And she's going to talk to you about experiment design.
Yes, thank you. I think I get to run in here and dance a little because I feel like Madonna, actually. It's a first for me with a microphone like that. So can you hear me well? Yeah. Yeah, it's great. I love it to be invited to give this lecture here and to see that people have already engaged in a lively conversation. And I've put the resources, I'm sorry for that, it might come back, so please bear with me. The resources, the main resources for my lecture, I've put them there, and you have dealt with them. You've read, or at least looked at 3 chapters in the book. Sorry. And you've also had a look at Arne Mangens and Don Kuiken's article, and Arne has filled us in a little bit on what they did just before. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to do it all, and I would like to ask you to really note down your questions and ask them. What I mean by do it all is that I know this is a very diverse audience here, and diverse, types of scholars coming here with different backgrounds and different expertise, and also with different projects that are in the make. So what I really try to do is to give you all what you need, and of course this is going to be a bit hard, so I'll ask you to ask your questions that are relevant to you, of course. Yes, so for me, as someone preparing such a lecture, you always have a bit afraid that there might be too much repetition there, it might be too basic, or on the other hand, more too advanced there, that you don't really cover important things. So what Monique said before, that we're going to have more training schools, is a big relief for me, and I hope for you as well. So let's get started here. Maybe one more word about where I come from. Göttingen University is a cool place too. We also have good weather, at least today. And we do all kinds of empirical studies, apply different methods to literature, both on the textual and on the cognitive side. So what does empirical actually mean? Really, I'm getting very basic here, as you see, but I think that's good for all of us to really focus on what we're doing. So in the first place, it means to rely on facts. Of course, we need to be, informed by the newest level of philosophy here. What really facts are, what is the status of facts, but in other terms I could say we rely on experience and observation. It also means that we are equipped to give clear and valid answers, at least if we do everything right, and that are based on systematic, transparent, reliable and replicable research. We also often strive for generalization, and we actually, in a way, entitled to do so because we observe the criteria for doing good research. And what allows us to do all that is that there are clear criteria for assessing the research quality, and this is, to me at least, one of the major things that comes with empirical research. So. In empirical research, there are many different ways of doing empirical research, but they all come together in having as a basic feature that the success here does not really depend, at least not entirely, on my genius, on my original way of thinking. That is my associations, my ideas, rhetorical skills, or my persuasive power, or my social power, the enormous scope of education, refinement, and so on, but on applying these criteria. So I turn to things outside my my mind and all that comes together in there, and I observe how these things behave. This is kind of in a nutshell that what the empirical research today means. It's kind of a soft definition here or description. So to make things a bit more complicated and to give you a broader overview, empirical research in literature means that you can look at, how many of you are actually looking at literature or not, how many of you are not looking at literature but other aspects of cultural life? Okay, right, so please understand literature here as a broader term for cultural artifacts. So we have basically two basic dimensions where we can focus, where we can center our research. The first one, which is obvious when you look at literature, is the text, right, or the features of the artifact that you're looking at. So you have the features, they come in frequencies, you set out to explore and find and test patterns. And this is normally done by digital humanities, computational linguistics, and natural language processing in an empirical way. You can look at functions of texts, of cultural artifacts in society and culture, in discourse situations, and so on. So this is done by corpus linguistics or corpus stylistics, and again by computational approaches. Then, interestingly, when looking at text, you can already say something about potential for aesthetic processing, for the effects in cognition and emotion of text. But this is important. Just saying something about the potential, you cannot really make valid fact-based claims about processing. It's more a status of generating hypotheses there. You can only say something about what the reader does if you look at the reader and test how the reader behaves if you submit him or her to some kind of manipulation, a benevolent manipulation, of course, but an empirical study. So, and this is where you look at the reader. Not necessarily does one have to do both, focus on the text, do textual research, and do reader response research or participants based research, but one can of course combine them. But it's perfectly fine if you focused on one side and do your research on one of these dimensions. So what you look at there is look at cognition, emotion, and behavior, which often is mediated by situational, medial, and cultural factors that might actually be the factors that you're mostly interested in, as, for example, presentation in digital media. So this is a field that, of course, has been studied by psychologists, a dimension that has been studied by psychologists, but also by sociologists and other social scientists. And I guess the label here is reader response. This is not a definitive categorization, of course. It just gives you an idea of where main research traditions can be located. So, and what is important here is to see that on both dimensions you can work with explanatory methods and exploratory ones. I'm going to go into a bit more detail just in a minute what that means. You can do quantitative and qualitative research, all within the empirical paradigm, and you can actually combine both qualitative and quantitative methods, and then you would be within a mixed method paradigm. And this is actually what in the book is also recommended, which is really a state of the art, but it poses additional costs on you because you have to learn both paradigms, the qualitative one with its criteria for good research and the quantitative one. And then the quantitative one, again, is a technical one, which we are actually focusing on here today and tomorrow and on Saturday. more is a technical one that involves knowledge about statistics and other technical aspects. Okay, so we come here together to look at or to do empirical research on complex humanities questions. And we have a problem because, as you know, empirical research comes from natural sciences, where people observe kind of easily observable, clear facts and relations and processes that are external to our consciousness. And we are looking at things that are within the minds of people, and in all kinds of dense interactions. So culture is complex cognition, if you just look at how cognition works, is very complex. Emotions are super complex. Literature, I mean, what is going on in text is complex. Technology is complex. If you looked at Anne Mangen's article, the things that are involved in digital reading and in the devices, you need to get a hold on that as well if you're interested in the research. So I guess we all come from humanity, so we are used to complexity and we kind of embrace it. We are used to understanding what is going on, how people, what it is like for people to actually be someone who reads literature under certain circumstances, and so on and so on. We mainly use hermeneutic, have used hermeneutic processes for that, so iterative processes for understanding and going deeper and deeper into the matter and embracing and exploring the complexity of it all. It is normally situated and wholesome. So, for example, if I read a book, then I make assumptions about the entirety of the book and not just certain words or certain types of words. But now that we are looking at empirical research, or looking at things from an empirical perspective, this complexity almost gets too overwhelming to bear, because here we have a different mindset. We want, at least as a tendency, I just said before, quantitative versus qualitative is kind of not a clear distinction anymore. There's not the battle anymore that used to be there. But we still have a kind of a general mindset of being very clear and establishing causal relationships, or at least saying something definitive and generalizable about certain associations or correlations. So, looking at all these things in culture, cognition, and trying to be on top of it and coming up with operational definitions for the aspects that we are looking at seems to be almost too much to bear. So should we better leave now, go and just leave it? Or should we, well, I guess this is a rhetorical question. We could actually use this kind of empirical visualization of the empirical research process. And I mean, not necessarily are we in the beginning simplistic, but we might have a very simple question, something that pops up, is it really different? Is it different for people if they read a book or some kind of fictional text on an iPad or on paper in a book? A simple question. Then you run into this whole knot of complexity if you start really exploring what this entails and all the factors that might be involved here. For example, starting with the role of fiction versus nonfiction, and so on and so on. But that is just the tip of the iceberg. And then, and this is what we try to do here with you in the training school, if all goes well, you come out at the end of the elegant simplicity, okay, where you're able to devise a good and meaningful experimental study design, not necessarily experimental, and have, if all goes well, good and clear results. So, as to the training school, right? Deal with the complexity of humanist questions, And what I want to do is highlight and show, and what we want to do, what we talked about, is highlight and show the most important building blocks for the empirical approach. We would like to invite you here, and you've come here to work out the design of exciting and also feasible studies, and hone your research questions, make them even more explicit and precise. And also work on the operationalization of the constructs, of the concepts you're interested in. And match your research questions and your goals to adequate methods. Also reflect on your resources. And by resources, I mean, what are the people you have? What are the mentors? Anna highlighted, where's Anna? Okay. Anna. She highlighted vividly how important it was to work with an experienced psychology person, professor here. But I mean, your mentors can also be psychology students or other people, you know. And if you're working on text, then of course you don't turn to psychology, but to computational linguistics or so. Okay, and the resources can also be, of course, what is the time that you have allotted, and what are your finances, and so on and so on. So this is kind of the real empirical research, and I'm starting with that here now. The lecture starts in terms of the content. The research process and empirical studies is a structured one, right? You have normally go through these steps, and they vary a bit. Some are very complicated. This is a very kind of a watered-down version of research models, and I've juxtaposed two here. So to the right, you have the process where you first ask a question, you know, before you hit the wool ball. Then you research the existing sources, and then you formulate an hypothesis, which is already you know, a refinement of the initial question. Then you go and design and eventually conduct a study. Then you draw your conclusions, discuss what you found, and you do report the results also in a very kind of structured and constrained manner. And we're not I'm not going to talk about the last two bits, and try to focus here on designing and conducting a study, but also saying important things about the first aspects. To the left, as I said, I juxtaposed two things. What I took out of the book that you read. So in order to kind of match what you've read to this basic structure here. So what Van Beer and colleagues said is, you go and you explore. You have your idea, you check the feasibility. This is really important of what you aim for, and then you draw up a conceptual model. What is that? What factors are there in there? You know, what variables are in there? How do they interact? What's the relationship? You also have to identify confounding factors, factors that you didn't think of in the beginning, but that are likely to play a role in, you know, in your results, and might actually harm your study if you don't pay attention to them. And then you go into a very, very important phase that is, I guess, one of the major differences between hermeneutic studies and empirical studies is that you really have to define here in what way your concepts that you're interested in, for example, emotional engagement in stories, relates to some external measure, right? So you have to come all the way from the complex model to the scale, to the items on the scale that you give to people. And you have to be highly specific there and precise. Okay, and then together with operationalization, you have to choose your research methods. Quick overview. I'm going to go through this a bit fast, but if there are questions, then please ask them later. the spectrum of empirical approaches, there are quantitative versus qualitative. So quantitative has aggregating measures here, kind of abstracting from the initial observations. You want to go and arrive at quantitative evidence. You use a statistical backup. You go for generalization. For example, if you have unethical heroes in a story, you want to be able to say something in general about unethical stories and whether or not they do decrease transportation of people when reading these stories into the story world. So people might actually not like them and therefore resist to be transported into the story world. Quantitative research has been attacked and has been, for example, named perilous, reductionist, and deterministic. The question is whether it really is that and whether we should not do that. Not engage in quantitative research because of that, or whether it might actually heighten our awareness of certain dangers. And I think the latter is the case, that we should, of course, remain skeptical, but so therefore not take the results of quantitative studies as pure facts, God-given or whatever, but see them critically, of course. Becoming more descriptive again, it is variable-oriented, and this is kind of a take-home thing, it is administered to settle the discussion. So I have a discussion going on, I have open question, and I administer quantitative research in order to settle the discussion. Qualitative research, by contrast, this is, kind of teasing them then apart in an ideal, typical way. Of course, it's a spectrum, and there are things in the middle as well. As a rule, it has relationship or engages with whole cases. It is more open-ended. And it explicitly involves subjective dimensions of interpretation, dimensions of interpretation. So the subjectiveness of the research is highlighted here. It is more concrete and situated, and therefore more natural. So you can really explore what people do when they live their lives with cultural artifacts. Again, criticism, called old-fashioned, anecdotal, overly subjective, uncontrolled. Again, we can counter these arguments here, as we will see. It's case-oriented instead of variable-oriented. And again, take home here, it's overall used for opening up the discussion, right? So exploring new lines of research, exploring new questions, or look at things that seem to be settled in a new way. Again, mixed method. They can and have been and should be, I guess, combined. So this is our research process, and this is the basic first step in Van Peer and colleagues, where you first explore the theories that you have to know when you ask your questions. You have to have a good look at the literature and evaluate how people have dealt with the issue that you're interested in, and see whether actually you're dealing with real evidence or is it just claims, and how were they produced, the data. And here the little lamp is highlighting here things that are normally not really highlighted. So you can look in research articles and see, look at the section where people point out what needs to be done in order to make their study better, or the open venues that were opened by the study. So it's kind of a good strategy to really explicitly go to these sections and look what are the open questions here, and then engage in reworking your hypothesis and your plan. Then the feasibility, I mentioned that before. You have to get a good grip on the actual scope of your project, so the time frame, the cost, the infrastructure that you have or that you need, so you can make decisions on where to go, what people to approach, whether to ask for grant money, to hire people, or to ask for grant money to go to places, and so on and so on. Meet people with who you can collaborate, and collaboration is really important in empirical research because you need other minds as well in order to be more objective or less subjective, less locked in your own world. And here you have to also get even more precise, define your concepts, redefine them, your constructs, and already have a little, extend your vision at the indicators for the concepts that you're interested in. So what measures can I actually use? What are the tools that I can use in order to really observe what I'm interested in? This is a super important step in the process. Make a conceptual model. From the first idea, go and really map out the elements of your study and the nature of their relationship. Round 2 of literature research, and formulate your hypothesis prediction. Really do this on paper. I see that all the time in myself. I think I know what I'm doing, what I'm interested in, but if I force myself to sit down and really write it down, then it's kind of magic how it shows itself not to be really precise, but there are still little blind spots in there or patches that are not really well worked out. So really take the time here and do refine your question and your hypothesis. And here I have to say that we have this focus on quantitative research, on experimental research in this training school, but of course, if you do descriptive research or exploratory research, qualitative research, then you normally don't set out to test hypotheses in a strict sense that Monique will also dwell on more in an hour, which eventually means that you already think about statistics when doing the first steps. But these studies have a different approach, but still formulating your hypotheses, your assumptions, putting them on paper is a very good and crucial exercise in order to be specific here as well. Also to be able and to be really sure that other people haven't really thought it up yet and go back to the literature. So, as I said, the focus here is on quantitative approaches, explanatory research, and a typical feature for explanatory research is that you have you're interested in causal relationships. You really want to know whether X leads to Y, whether X causes Y. If X, then Y. X is the observable cause here and is the so-called independent variable. For some people, this might be really, heard over and over, but still very important to get these really get a foot on the ground here. So the independent variable is the cause, and it's also called factor, right? Interchangeably. So if you hear factor, that's the independent variable. And this is what I manipulate if I engage in studies that really are interested in causal relationships. As one can deduct from the word, the dependent variable is the Y, is the effect, is the thing that is dependent on the cause. So if I change something in X, then Y changes as well as a function of X. And the dependent variable is actually what I measure, and this is where I need to get the link, and this is one of the major challenges and great things where you also can get very creative in order how to really devise the indicators for certain things that you're interested in. So, for example, what I did, I don't want to go into much detail here, but I thought about what's my, what have I done here? So, for example, I thought about, I did research on metaphor processing, and I was interested in, within the field of psychology, of a field of expertise, whether newbies, whether novices, process metaphors differently from experts. So my hypothesis here is expertise predicts metaphor processing within a certain discourse circle. In other terms, if expertise is present, the X, then technical metaphors within this discourse are processed like literal language. I'm not going into detail here, but just as an example. So the independent variables, you might notice I have two, is our expertise with two levels, expert versus novice. And also note that we have a subject variable here. So I drew the people from a pool and I sorted them according to their level of expertise. I didn't induce expertise here, so I didn't manipulate expertise. And the other independent variable is statement type. So I had different metaphorical and non-metaphorical statements. And the dependent variable was the metaphor processing. I used an offline measure here, so a measure that used a rating scale in order, and I looked at how people would, what kind of statements people would prefer. And given a certain theory, the preference for a certain statement type would say something about the level or the mode of processing that people engage in. This just as a brief example. This was the scale, just to give you an insight in how we did that, with one statement to the left and the other one to the right, and two grammatically different versions of them, and people had to indicate their preference here. Another really important thing, as I said before, are possible confounding variables, and there you have to be like a detective or so, and be very critical. Think about, really get your thinking machine going. Engage in thinking about what factors might be hidden in the world that actually might have an influence on your basic assumption. You have to look for them, and you can look for them in the literature. You can talk to people. You should talk to people. As I said, empirical research is a collaborative thing. And for example, in the IPET experience, what were the confounding variables there? I thought, I don't know about the research process, but I thought maybe the genre thing, so fiction versus nonfiction, was not there in the beginning. The initial idea might have been just on-screen or e-reading versus non-e-reading or paper reading. And then maybe you came up with the idea, oh, but fiction versus nonfiction might actually be a confounding variable here. And therefore you then went and included it into your study. I don't know how that went, but this would be one potential process that when I identify a possible confounding variable factor, then I can actually go, if I'm interested in it, go and include it in the study as an independent variable. If I'm not interested, genuinely interested in this confounding factor, there are ways of exclude them from the analysis and still deal with them in order that they don't get, to be a monster that messes up my research. For example, you can measure and control them in the statistical analysis. If you're running statistical analyses, you can keep them constant. And you can use randomization. Randomization is really good. If you do experiments, then you should always try and do randomization, because it prevents, for example, confounding variables to exert a certain unwanted force. It also helps in many other ways that I at least can mention. So going to the conceptual model, this is actually copied from the Van Peer and colleagues book, getting you an idea on possible relations between different factors in your conceptual model when you draw up your idea. So, and this is where I'd like to ask you, maybe, so we're already at 40 minutes, maybe very briefly, to think about the conceptual model, we've talked about that already, of the loss in an iPad study. So what are the independent variables? So what is are there more than one variables? What are the dependent variables? How are they measured maybe? And confounding variables? And what's the specific and precise relation between the variables, right? Kind of putting yourself into the shoes of Anne and Don when devising the story. Just try to remember what she said, right? Yeah, just in order to make this a bit more vivid, right? Think about, you've now thought about what people did. So, for example, what is the X here in the study? So the independent variable, it's not a independent variable.
What the independent variable is within the iPad study.
The device, right? The medium, right? Medium is one. Was there another one? Yeah. So that was they called it paratext, right? Or genre, or so exactly. So we have two axes that are supposed to have an influence on what? Narrative engagement. Exactly, and this is the y, or the dependent variable. Okay, that's it for now. Was there another dependent variable? Reading time, yes. So as you can see, there are all kinds of possible dependent variables that you can measure here. And then the interesting thing is you can see whether there are any relations between them, so correlations again. Okay, just very, very brief interlude here. Thank you. Going back to the research process, we're now at 3 to the left, the conceptual model. And we haven't really talked about the possible confounding factors here, but there's more time for that later on. So a crucial step is the step of the operationalization. I've said that before. So this is where you actually formulate all the elements in your study, in your model, in empirical terms. This is where you establish the indicators of the assumed processes, events, and phenomena. And this is where you define the dependent variable operationally. For example, you want to look at transportation, people getting, transported into a story world. You're interested in narrative coherence. You're interested in empathy, or you want to look at metaphor. Whatever it is that you're interested in, you have to define the thing that you're interested in such terms that makes it possible for you to actually find concrete indicators, for example, scales or a coding scheme for metaphor, an identification procedure that is clear and valid and reliable, and that really allows you to argue on good grounds that your measure really measures the concept you're interested in, yeah? Whether it is reliable across coders, whether it is valid. And one indicator here is what Anne mentioned and used, the narrative engagement scale, which she got from somewhere and which she then adapted to her needs and matched to her goals. And then I say choose the appropriate research method. Of course, the indicators and the measures are already part of the research method, but there are more things involved here. So first of all, as we just you have to think about the kind and the number of variables. So are you interested in causation? Is it okay for you to just see whether things are associated? Are you interested in the text, right? Do you just want to look at the text, or are you interested in the reader, or do you want to look at both at the same time? Then, as to the research design, you have to decide whether you want an experimental design, whether you want to look at causation again, or whether you want to use another approach, whether it's more important for you to look at natural context, for example, because the problem with the experiments is that you normally get some artificial, a certain degree of artificialness in there. You have to think about, if you go for a design in the experimental paradigm, whether you want to use it within subjects or between subjects. I'm going to explain that a little bit in a minute, which is you have to determine the kind of comparison you're doing. Then you have to make a decision on the level of measurement, which interestingly produces the acronym NOIR. I'm going to go into that as well. Then, as to the data collection, yeah, again, is it an experiment you're doing involving questionnaires? Are you going to do a qualitative research involving interviews or thinking aloud protocols? Or are you actually looking at textual data and doing using natural language processing tools and automated identification procedures within a computational paradigm? You have to think about the stimuli if you do a manipulation that you get to the participants. That is, for example, items on a scale or the questions that you ask people. This is really crucial, and you need to reserve time for that. You have to devise coding schemas if you, for example, run interviews, because they will produce a lot of unstructured information that you need to structure, and there are different ways of doing that, but one would be to pre-structure the pre-define what you're looking for within the data. And all this, of course, depends on the resources you have and also on the conventions in the field that you mainly are situated in. Okay, so starting kind of at the beginning here, in terms of the study design, and as I said, focusing on the experiment, this is the classical experiment. It is looking for causation. It is designed in a way to allow for generalization in the end and for statistical testing. And it typically administers a pre-test, then a treatment, and then a post-test. So I see, for example, the literature often has something, for example, with alcohol, that the loudness of voice being measured before a treatment with alcohol, and the loudness of voice measured after it. And then if there's a difference, and if all other factors are constant, then there is some grounds for you to assume that alcohol has something to do with the loudness of voice. So the group of people undergoing the treatment is called the study group or the experimental group, or there are different names for that. And then there is a control group, which does not undergo the treatment and is tested in the same way. So the loudness of voices would be tested here as well within a linear time frame. And and because you have the control group, you can really say something about, in a general way, about whether alcohol has an influence on voice here. This is the very basic, in a nutshell, classical design with the control group. There are all kinds of expansions on this basic classical designs. For example, with a placebo group. So people would get free alcohol. For example, thinking they were drinking alcohol, so you'd have another factor controlled for, because the conventions, for example, or thinking that something is the case, and people, the subjective realities has been established to have a big influence on observable behavioral facts as well. Okay. Subject variables, as I said before, it is important to note that these are not manipulable. So gender, age, and expertise are examples of things that you normally don't manipulate in the kind of experience that we are looking at. Of course, also these things can be subject to empirical research, but in our research, you often draw, from a big population and then have these as prefabricated, as it were, variables here. So another question here is the design, and Anne said something about that before, of the Lost in an iPad study. What design was used here? What was the treatment? Were there pre and post tests? Was there a control group? Just think about it briefly, reflect on it, maybe talk to your direct neighbor. Right? So thinking about comparing it with this classical basic schema for experimental design, how did it maybe deviate from that, and how did it match it? Pre-test, treatment, post-test. Again, 2 minutes. So this is what they did. They did not use a basic experimental design, but a factorial design, which means that they had not just one independent variable, but two in this case. Anne said that before when she reported the experiments here on stage. It was a 2x2 design, and you can see it here. 2x2 design produces 4 different conditions. Right? You have 2 independent variables. You have 2 levels for these variables, which are iPad and booklet for the medium, and for the paratext you have non-fiction and fiction. And then multiplying these, you get 4 different conditions when using the iPad and the non-fiction condition, when using the iPad in a fictional condition, and then the other 2, which is called a 2x2 factorial design. And I was pointing to the table 1 in the article where you can see that. So question now, if I have something like 2x3x2, how many levels do I have here, and how many variables, independent variables? Just to make sure that we, you come across this in articles all the time, that you know how to read it. So there are 3 variables. The numbers in this little 2x3x2 thing indicate the levels of the specific variables, and the number itself stands as a placeholder for a variable. So if you go for the second one, you have 3 different variables, and then you have different levels there, different number of levels in there. And then multiplying this gives you the number of conditions that you actually have to factor in for your experiment. And then you have to think about how many participants do I need, and what about the ensuing statistical analysis and so on. So this is where things get technical, and where you actually get and concrete, where you start thinking about how many participants do I need. But again, deciding about the methods depends on your goals, and depends on whether you want to settle certain discussion rather, or whether you want to open something up. And do you want to use powerful statistical testing? That is, do I want to validly generalize? And that leads you to the question, or to the moment in which you have to choose the type of information that your experiment or that your study actually gives you. This is where we go to, maybe you've heard about this, some people will have, the levels of the measurement. Levels of measurement are ordered hierarchically. So if you look on the left, you start with a very basic one that has the least amount of information in them. The more information you have, the more powerful your statistical analyses can be in the end. It starts with the nominal level, goes on to the ordinal level, the interval level, and then the highest one is the ratio level. The attributes on the nominal level are just mentioned, are just names. And then in the ordinal one, you can actually order things and display an order. And in the interval and the ratio on these levels, you can actually compute directly the distances between certain measures. Examples for the nominal ones are, as I said before, gender and, for example, word class. And if you're interested in textual studies, you can assess these in open and structured questions. You can identify, for example, metaphors or word classes. And then, what you can do with them is you can count the occurrences of these nominal categories. For example, proportions of metaphors and text, frequency distributions of male versus female viewers of certain TV series, and so on. There's a lot you can do with these, right? And it's called weak, but I think it's pretty powerful if you come from humanities already, to be able to measure and to count things and to draw up proportions and frequency distributions, and you can run statistical analyses on these. Then the ordinal one, for example, would be rank or ordered age groups, or, for example, sentiment, where you have in natural language processing, where you have three categories for sentiment analysis, which are ordered. You can ask people for ranking, you can devise the age groups, and you can have sentiment identified by the computer. Then there is the interval category. An example here is temperature measured in Celsius, and you can, for example, use a Likert scale for our means, where people give you information about how they what the subjective effect of some treatment is on them. You can already compute means here, and this is the big kind of the jump from the ordinal scale to the interval scale. This, for example, allows ANOVA analysis of the variance of means and assumptions or assertions about the degree to which you can generalize your findings. And then ratio, for example, age, it has an absolute 0 point, for example, it can be identified or given to you by a constant sum rating scale, which is the one in the front, and you can already multiply here. So you can say, for example, my dad is twice as old as I am, or the rating for performance is twice as high as that for body style. I took that from the internet. I think it's for cars. That I can really generalize from the results of the study later on, and that I don't have unwanted effects, for example, if I draw people from a reading group that shares certain factors altogether in terms of age or in terms of social background or education and so on, and then compare it to another one that doesn't have these features and therefore have actually confounding factors in there. So randomization takes out people of their clusters and rearranges them again, and therefore assures that I have actually if I've test groups that are composed of independent subjects that don't share certain factors that I don't control. So in keeping, in using randomization, I can keep certain things constant. Maybe we can talk about that in the discussion as well. I'm going to go now into within subject design and between subject design, and there it plays a role as well. Running through what we just heard again. Okay, this is where we left off. Okay, so research design in terms of within or between subjects. You've probably heard this before. This is the moment where you decide what kind of comparison do you make. Do you use groups, or do you use specific, or do you use single participants? Let me explain. In the within subjects design, you compare conditions within one participant. Here in Anne Mangen's study, for example, it would have meant that you compare how people react to a story when reading something on an iPad and when reading something in a booklet. And they decided not to go for the within subjects design for probably quite obvious reasons. It means repeated measures. So, for example, people within one experiment, within one study, should rate multiple texts in a row. Yeah, say something about I engage here. I feel I can put myself into the shoes of the main character, and so on and so on. One subject through different tests. You have pre-test and post-tests here. So you have what I just showed, first test, assessment, then you have the treatment, and then you have post-test. This is all within one subject. This means that one participant is used multiply, right? You test condition 1, for example, text 1, and then you test text 2, condition number 2. This is different in the between subjects design, where you compare conditions across certain groups. And you put the participants into the groups normally by a randomization procedure. So, for example, you have either, as Anne Mangen showed, a fiction condition or a non-fiction condition. You have an iPad condition or a booklet condition here. Or you have, for example, if you want to screen people beforehand, either extroverts or introverts. So you can look at personality types and all kinds of things, and then form groups from there, and then compare how people that have a specific feature that shares certain feature react differently. Here, each participant is used only once. Okay, so you have a group of people in the iPad condition and a group of people in the booklet condition. As we just saw, the factorial design means that you have, for this specific study that we looked at, Anna showed 4 different conditions. So you need more participants for the between subjects design here. The problems that might occur here in the 2 different designs are such. In the within subjects design, you may have order effects. So imagine you have give people certain text to read. So how can you tell that reading a certain text before a certain text or after a certain text doesn't have an effect on the reading of the texts that are read before or after? I mean, effect on the texts that are read after. So there may be carryover effects, latent effects, or learning effects. You can actually counter this by counterbalancing. That is, you can use different orders of presenting the stimuli to the people, or the measures to the people, and then have do that systematically, so you actually can eliminate these possible text effects by counterbalancing. This avoids the so-called equivalent group problem, which is a problem that you have for between subject design. And it is good, which I will explain in a second, and it is good for studies with few participants and for studies that have separate tasks that cost little time, because the subjects, of course, have to do all the tasks that are part of the study after one another. So you can't split that up. Here you have what I just mentioned, the equivalent group problem, which means that you possibly have to deal with confounding variables. For example, in a study such as Anna's, you might have fiction lovers, right, that cluster in certain groups. So, and that kind of mess up the means that you get from the group if you assess their, for example, their transportation ability. People who often and with a lot of motivation engage in reading fiction behave differently. That is quite probable from people who do not, as a rule. And if you happen to have such people in a group, in an experimental group, then the results will not be really generalizable, but actually have confounding factor built in here. So people in a group might be too similar to each other, right, in the experimental group. And this is where you actually go and do the randomization and take these people out of their, as it were, similarity or clusters. Randomization means that you assign people to groups by chance, and that you normally have to have a minimum number of participants per group. Or you normally do it on groups that have a minimum number. It is done easily and fast, and this is also why it is kind of a panacea for all kinds of problems that we have in terms of the generalizability of results or the setup of studies that should lead to generalizable results. Another way of conquering the equivalent group problem is matching. This is where you actually go first and see what features do the people have, and then you match the certain people who are very similar with respect to a certain feature, and make sure that they end up in different groups, right? For example, fiction lovers would be taken out of group A and be put in an equal number in group A and B, in order to make sure that the groups are don't have these clusters. Right. This is a process. Matching is a process that takes more time and is costly in terms of time and other resources. And this is why randomization is really the process that you normally go for. Yeah, matching is quite elaborate. So much for this kind of this aspect of study design. The last aspect I'm going to talk about is the aspect of stimuli, of actual materials that to give to people. If you're interested in causal design, but in testing causal relationships, but in general, what is it that you give to people, what you expose people to, and also in the time frame, in the order of sequences within your study, what do you do when? So, for example, the reading materials in Anna's study, the material was one text, Murder in the Mall, and it was the same text, and this is a big strength of this experiment, that you use the very same text in both conditions. Often you have a problem if you're interested in different genres and different kinds of, in manipulations on the text, that you have to come up with items that are equivalent in terms of length, in terms of content, in terms of style, in terms of all kinds of things that need to be held constant in order to just tease or just get at what you're interested in, right? I just want to look at the metaphor, so I have to keep everything else constant. This experiment did that. And elegantly just altered the beginning, the paratext, as it were, and said, okay, this is a fictional text and this is a non-fictional text. in the introduction, in the instruction to the participants. It was also, but it was a bit adapted from, like, taken out of nature, as it were, and then adapted for the experiment. And this is also a very typical process that you normally you want to exert as much control as you can within your experiment, and therefore often people really compose their own stimuli, make them, because then they can control all factors. But also often you take something from, literature, from other cultural artifacts, films and so on, and then adapt the material that you get there in a way that still allows it to be quite natural, because this is eventually what you want. You want to say something about what really happens in culture and people understanding media and literature. But you have to control it as well, because otherwise you have all kinds of factors in there that might actually be the cause, but you don't know it for certain effects. Okay. Now the order of sequences, again, summing up the variables, the independent variables. First of all, we said that before, you have the instructions, the paratext, so two conditions in terms of the genre, the paratext, fiction, nonfiction, and then the independent variable number 2, the medium of presentation, iPad versus booklet. And here is the order sequence. For all conditions, again, a great strength of this particular experiment, everybody did the same. They first got an introduction, then they read the text. They didn't know that one group had a different intro than the other one. And then they got the questionnaires. And then Anna mentioned that briefly, and this is the first bullet point here. After the treatment, so after reading the text either on an iPad or in a booklet, the first thing that you do to people, right, then when they're freshly manipulated, as it were, you should first put the first most important measure should be put right after the manipulation. So I guess that was the narrative?
No, it was the interface appearance.
Okay.
And then it was the comprehension measures, and then the absorption questionnaire, and then lastly was the demographics, including the experience with electronic media.
Okay, right. But this is, if you picture the procedure, people sit down and then get these different things to do, little tasks from their perspective. And this is also one take-home thing that is also presented in the book, I think quite convincingly, is that you have to put yourself into the shoes of the people undergoing your studies, whatever it is, whether they are interviews or experiments or so on. Really think in terms of how they think, how they approach things, and make it clear what you want from them, make it understandable. And right, this goes all the way from the instructions to the items themselves, if you use questionnaires and scales and so on, in order to really measure what you want to measure. So this is the last slide. Possible, again, going to the grand scale of empirical research here. Possible problems that you run into, typical problems and typical solutions. That doesn't mean we have solutions to everything, and you have to be creative in order to administer, an appropriate solution to a possible problem that you run into. But subjectively influencing the outcome, that is a typical problem, and we can, even if we use hardcore quantitative measures, we cannot really be sure that we don't do that. For example, the way we formulate the items, we have to make sure that we don't put some bias in there, asking people to rate something, there's some descriptive statement in there, and the formulation of the statement should be done in a way to avoid any possible bias. I don't want to make people say something that I assume they should say, right? Then the confounding variables, I've talked about them. socially desired answering. There are things that are normally deemed desired, and there are things that are not. And for example, one thing is that people normally say that they read a lot in assessments of reading, and normally more than they actually read, because it's socially desired to read a lot. Then ceiling floor effects. We talked about that, and Anne mentioned it, I think, as well. So if you have measures that render very high, for example, high means for all or for a significant proportion of your participants, and there is no variation in their answering, for example, certain questions, rating certain items, then your measure is not fine-grained enough. These are ceiling effects if you have very high, if people converge in answering with high markings, for example, or floor effects when everybody converges in for example, saying this story did not help me in putting myself into the shoes of the character. So you have to be aware of that. And then the uncontrolled variation within the groups. There could be too much uncontrolled variation within the groups. This is why within subject design it can result in very powerful statistics, because you have a constant there. You have the conditions, you test various conditions in one subject. So it's constant in subjects here. And if you have groups, you could run into trouble with too much error in terms of the groups being too diverse. Then you could have the test effects that I mentioned, and I think Monique is going to go into that. Yeah, a couple of solutions were presented already. I mentioned it at least, work in teams, team up. For example, also when you when you code things, when you conduct interviews and then code the interviews for the categories that you're interested in. Or for example, if you annotate text for metaphor, for stylistic devices, don't do that alone if you can help it. Use others, people's, minds as well, and workforce, and in order to get it away from your own mind, from your subjective view of the world, and also use measures, use technical statistics in order to actually measure the reliability of the measure across different coders if you can. Then adjust your model, your conceptual model, and your methods well, right? Test that, think about it, talk to people about it, do pilot studies. That means develop your measures, for example, questionnaires and scales, and then use them and see how people actually react. And then there are different ways, also explained nicely in the book, in which you can do that. Ask people, for example, to scribble down in the margins of a questionnaire what they understand about a certain question, or about certain scale or so, in order to really be sure that people understand what you want from them here. Then go back and do your experiments and use randomization. That is, assign subjects randomly, and also assign all kinds of places in experimental design and study design where you can use randomization, not only in subjects but also in items. So, for example, the order in which items are presented should also be subject to randomization and counterbalancing. These are a couple of solutions to possible problems that you might run into. And rounding it off for now, right? We have these complex questions, and we want to arrive at the elegant simplicity. And of course, there's a lot of work involved. And I guess one last thing that I want to share with you here is that in hermeneutic humanities research studies, normally you go into the study, and then you work, start working, and it's kind of an even process, or maybe you can, see the process as this. But with empirical studies, you do a lot of work in the beginning, and this is probably the point where you actually get your method, you have your experimental design in place, you get the booklets printed or on screen or whatever, and you can actually run the study, and then you have a drop in the activity you actually have to put into the research. Later on, when you write it up, it goes up a bit again, but this is a typical curve of empirical research with a lot of work in the beginning and a lot of preparation work. And this is also a difference to hermeneutic and humanist study design, as I say. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and make sure that you ask the questions that you have.